Everybody who is not familiar with Clubsy, you can find us on Facebook, you can find us on Instagram, you can also find us on LinkedIn. We put our Zionism into action, our love for Israel into action, hence this evening. Our vision is to create a network of leaders who embrace their Jewish identity, are proud of their Jewish heritage, and also who are equipped to adequately address issues of bigotry as well as anti-Zionism head on. We are so privileged to have with us Professor Anne Bayefsky. She will tell us about what's going on at the United Nations, why it's so important for us to have an understanding of it, and what to do. Professor Anne Bayefsky is the director of the Touro Institute on Human Rights and the Holocaust, which is a UN-accredited NGO. She is also the president of Human Rights Voices, which is based in New York. A human rights lawyer in training, Professor Bayefsky has taught international law, constitutional law, as well as civil liberties at universities in both Canada and the United States. Professor Bayefsky has served on both governmental and non-governmental delegations to the United Nations, attending meetings as well as conferences around the world since 1984. Professor Bayefsky attended, as many of us may be familiar with, that infamous conference in Durban in 2001 as a representative of the International Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists. Professor Bayefsky is going to be speaking with us for about half an hour, and then we will take questions and answers from attendees. So if, as the presentation continues, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box, and those will be attended to at the end. Over to you, Professor Bayefsky.
Thank you very much, Olga. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I know that this audience is composed of both young people and older people like myself. And so I want to explain a little bit of the background and not take anything for granted. And if you have more questions about that, please don't hesitate to ask in the chat. First of all, the United Nations is composed of 193 countries, and the majority of those countries are not full democracies. That's not how the UN started out. It started out with a grand promise of the equality of all nations, large and small. Since that time, it has created, shortly thereafter, a central human rights agency, a body called the Commission on Human Rights. Now, the Commission on Human Rights ended up fixating on the state of Israel, which overwhelmingly had more condemnations than any other country on earth, no matter the horrors that were going on around the world. It was eventually, the state of Libya was actually at some point the president of the Human Rights Commission on Human Rights. And so in 2006, it was disbanded and it was reformed. It was reformed and taken, this place was taken by the Human Rights Council. Essentially, they changed the name from commission to council and nothing much else. So this council is composed of 47 countries. And guess what? The majority of them are not full democracies. And the balance of power is held by the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. So Islamic states hold the balance of power. The membership of this so-called human rights body includes countries like Libya is back on, China, Cuba, Russia, Somalia, Venezuela, Eritrea. So the idea that this body speaks with authority on what does and doesn't constitute human rights is not only suspect, it's a farce. So what has happened since 2006? Israel has once again become the fixation of the Human Rights Council. And that is a problem not only for Jews, but also for real victims of human rights violations around the world, whose suffering and whose situation goes ignored while countries use Israel as a means to divert attention from their own circumstances and as really a vehicle for anti-Semitism, for modern anti-Semitism, for treating Israel differently than any other state in the world. Not that Israel has never done any wrong, couldn't do better, can't improve, but not, the agenda is not to treat Israel on the same level as every other country, to work towards progress and a better world for people everywhere, but to treat and isolate and delegitimize a Jewish state. It's in that context that the United Nations has now undertaken the worst, the most heinous undertaking or investigation or so-called inquiry against the state of Israel ever in UN history. Now, there was a resolution, of course, 1975, where Zionism was called a form of racism and racial discrimination. But that was not operationalized to the same extent and in the same format that this inquiry purports to be. Now, how did it all start? Well, last May, Hamas lobbed approximately 4,300 rockets into Israel. It targeted civilians. That's a war crime. It hid behind and was embedded in Palestinian civilian neighborhoods in order to engage in that rocket fire. And that itself is also a war crime. So in that context, Israel was forced to defend its population. And it did so by fighting back. Now, the conflict itself lasted approximately 11 days. It was short, relatively speaking. Of course, it was entirely avoidable by if Hamas rescinded or rethought its commitment in the Hamas charter to genocide against the Jewish people. But that wasn't the opposition that Israel faces. So defending itself, the conflagration due to a close roughly in the middle of May. But 6 days later, after a ceasefire had already been declared, the United Nations Human Rights Council held what they called an emergency session. And in this emergency session, which was held at the behest of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, so Islamic states, and what the UN refers to as the State of Palestine, which is not a state, but that's what the name is at the United Nations, they called for an emergency session. And at that emergency session, they adopted a resolution which wasn't directly related to the conflagration, which they said was the raison d'etre of the actual emergency session. Oh no, this setup was this fraud, adopted a resolution which did not have a single vote from Western democracies in favor of this resolution. It adopted a vote that created a so-called commission of inquiry. And this commission of inquiry has a number of features that are completely unprecedented. This is what anti-Semitism looks like today in the history of the Council and of the United Nations. For one thing, it gives them a mandate to investigate, I'm quoting it, to investigate, identify, and indicate, remedial responses for all underlying root causes. It charges it with unearthing discrimination and repression based on national identity, ethnic identity, racial identity, and religious identity. And it charges it with creating, spawning measures to be taken by third states. Now, the other feature of it is it's in perpetuity. It has no end date. Also, virtually unheard of in UN with one very different exception, never in the history of the United Nations system, because the human rights system, because the point of the human rights system in theory is to monitor and revisit and reconsider situations, but not in Israel's case. Israel's a permanent violator, according in this UN milieu. So suddenly, in the middle of it, it refers to violations of human rights. It's going to monitor violations of human rights and humanitarian law, beginning or leading up to and past April 13th. Well, I had to think twice about what was April 13th. It wasn't the May conflict, which was ostensibly the reason for the Human Rights Council's emergency session in the first place. No. April 13th was the beginning of Ramadan, and a series of events whereby riots, violence, intended to provide the fiction that somehow Jews were responsible for preventing Muslims from freedom of religion, from practicing their religion. In fact, what Israel was trying to do was to prevent violence and to allow access and freedom of religion. But instead, it refers to April 13th. Why? Because this inquiry is intended to inflame Muslim feelings and sensibilities, to create an environment that Israel is engaged in a religious war. It's an incredibly dangerous situation. It's not, even according to this UN now, it's not about land. It's about Jewish repression of Muslim rights. It's an outrage. It's particularly an outrage because, today is the so-called International Day of Holocaust Remembrance. It is the anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz concentration camp. And today, the United Nations spent 1 hour commemorating the liberation of Auschwitz and committing themselves, they said, to never again. Except that every other day of the year, the Jewish state is subject to again and again attempts to demonize, to destroy, to discredit, and to turn the Jewish state into a global pariah. The Jewish state, which is in essence the refuge of every Jew on earth, and a country for which guarantees freedom of religion for Muslims, for Christians, and other communities, ethnic and religious communities, in contrast to the life of Christians and Jews and others like the Baha'is in Arab states, in Muslim states. Jews fled Arab lands, fearing for their lives and their freedoms, and went to Israel for protection. Arabs in Israel enjoy more democratic rights than in any Arab country. So, but according to the UN human rights system, the target is Israeli repression, so-called, and discrimination, systematic discrimination of Muslims and Arabs. Now, this commission of inquiry has been given enormous resources. And one of the issues which I think it's important for us to recognize is that the United States pays 22% of the budget of the United Nations, the regular budget. And at the end of December, this commission of inquiry was funded by the General Assembly through the regular budget, which means that United States taxpayers are paying 22% of the budget of this commission inquiry. That ought to be completely unacceptable to Americans. And currently, in the next week or so, Congress will determine the funding of the government for the next for the remaining of the 2022 fiscal year. And we have a very limited amount of time to try to tell Congress, our members of Congress, members of the Appropriations Committee, that this is unacceptable, that we refuse to legitimize and to bankroll this pogrom is what it is. The other feature of it is that the inquiry had to be, there had to be appointed 3 people who would be the members of it and carry out its work. And the president of the Human Rights Council, a Muslim lawyer from Fiji, appointed 3 people. Now, the UN rules require that any investigator satisfy certain criteria, in particular, independence, impartiality, and objectivity. And the trouble with these 3 people is that they satisfy none of them. They're not independent, they're not impartial, they're not objective. And they also don't have the integrity to know that they don't satisfy any of those criteria and therefore shouldn't have accepted the offer of the job. Now, in particular, the chair of it is called a woman by the name of Nave Pillay, who was the former High Commissioner for Human Rights for 6 years, from 2008 to 2014. Now, Nave Pillay is notorious for a number of things. Number one, she was a champion of the Goldstone Report. The Goldstone Report, which had a central lie that Israel deliberately targeted Palestinian children and civilians. Not that they were put in harm's way by their parents and by their governments and by their leadership. Not that Israel did its best to avoid them, and that when civilians were killed, it didn't attempt to A, avoid it, B, ensure that its method of targeting would become more and more sophisticated as time went on in terms of their methodologies, and trying everything they could to avoid civilian casualties. But when their own people are using civilian deaths and civilians themselves as vehicles for their grotesque political ends, civilians get hurt. That's obviously something that is to be regretted. Israel expressed regret, and instead, and tried its best, as I say, to avoid it. From the other side, however, came when Israel civilians, were the explicit target of Palestinian terrorists and Palestinian leaderships, there was celebration. So, and moreover, there is what they call a pay to slay law, which actually pays Palestinian terrorists to kill Jews, It rewards them fiscally, which is obviously acts as an incentive and an incitement to do it again. So in this environment, you have Nave Pillay stepping in to agree with the outcome of the Goldstone Report. And when Goldstone himself withdrew, said he had made a mistake, an error, said he wouldn't have come to that conclusion himself, Pillay continued to champion it in its original form. Moreover, during the war of in the summer of 2014, Pillay herself perpetrated the grotesque lie that Israel deliberately targeted civilians. It's a blood libel, is what it is. And she's on record as having said that. She is also the champion of the Durban Conference. She herself was a native of Durban, South Africa, and took it upon herself to make the resurrection of Durban and its legitimization and the central lie of Durban, that Israel is a racist state, to champion it and to hold Durban, the second and third reiterations of the Durban Conference in Geneva and in New York, to get the Durban outcome and the declaration reaffirmed. That's Nave Pillay. And here she is appointed to head this inquiry. So since that time, she spent the last few years of her life making public speeches, videos that state that Israel is engaged in apartheid, that BDS, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel, is a good idea, and promoting it. And yet, here we have a person who is in charge of an inquiry who's allegedly impartial. And the other two individuals, one from Australia, Chris Sidoti, and Maluna McCarthy Qatari from India, are also on record as having a particular animus towards the state of Israel that has had various concrete manifestations. So it's a mug's game. It's rigged. The whole thing is a kangaroo court. It is intended to find Israel guilty, supposedly, of apartheid, then to use that, because apartheid is a violation of the Rome Statute, which set up the International Criminal Court. It's a crime against humanity. To make Israel and Israelis and their governments and the members of the IDF guilty of crimes against humanity and subject to prosecution, both in domestic courts and international courts. Thirdly, having come to the apartheid conclusion and the guilties of war crimes and crimes against humanity and so on, to find Israel legitimately subject to boycotts, divestment, and sanctions, because if it practices apartheid, well, then it ought to be isolated as a global pariah. And lastly, as two of the members of the inquiry are already on record as saying, calling for an arms embargo of Israel, lest the Jewish state be able to defend itself. So it's an abomination. There is no other word for it. And the question before us is, what can we do about it? So number one, we can ensure, the first most important thing is to discredit it, to delegitimize the so-called delegitimizers. And I'm going to just quickly, before we open the floor for questions, point you to my website that I've created in order to help people go through provide tools for fighting back. Now, if you go to the top, this is my website, www.humanrightsvoices.org, okay? And at the very top of it, I have something called Pile's Pogrom, named after the chairman, the chair of the actual Star Chamber. So here she is, and here is my, if you scroll down, you will find the mandate, the budget, the more details about the inquiry members. We may be changing up this page to provide more and more details, but the link will remain the same. So if you go down to the bottom right, it says submissions. So if you click on that, it takes you to a page which tells you about what it better describes, more greater detail, what you can do to help delegitimize this grotesque effort by the United Nations. It tells you why to make a submission. The Commission of Inquiry itself has issued a so-called call for submissions, and therefore it expects, of course, a series of submissions about why Israel's an apartheid state and fake victims of, or alleged victims of so-called Israeli violations. And I think it's imperative to send them exactly the opposite, what they don't want to hear, the true facts about Israel and its record and its intentions. Now, I'm going to just stop there about who should submit. If you see it, it says individuals, organizations, legislators, victims of modern anti-Semitism, victims of Palestinian terror, students, teachers, campus groups, Jewish organizations. That means you. I don't know who you are. Nice to meet you, but I'm not sure who you are. But whoever you are, you count. Your voice counts. you can put in a submission. So there are no pre-qualifications, no limit about age and so on, or expertise. You know enough to make this, to make your voice heard. Now, there is only one caveat, and that is, in order to put in a submission, your submission has to be about 5 acceptable topics, and I've given them here. Now, the thing about these topics is they're completely open-ended. Nothing you do or care about vis-a-vis the state of Israel is going to be irrelevant. The first one, underlying root causes. If you just look at the first bullet, underlying root causes of recurrent tensions, systematic discrimination and repression based on national, et cetera, religious identity. The UN in the last few days has put out even a more detailed description, which I'll put up, but you don't have to know anything more about than to know this. The Commission interprets this as it having no temporal restrictions. Now, why did they say that? Because they intend to go back to the creation of the state of Israel to begin with. Well, guess what? So can we. Go back to the beginning of the state of Israel's creation. Go back farther in time to the historic connection, unbroken connection between the Jewish people and the land of Israel. It calls for all, it says it will investigate all underlying root causes. Well, we know what underlying root causes is. Let's say you do nothing else than take a picture of a suicide bombed out bus in Israel, or the victims of the Passover massacre in Netanya, in synagogues targeted, and so on. What about Apartheid Week on campus? That's a root cause. That's part of the protraction of the conflict. And so you can simply link to an article that you've read online. You can go to a picture. If you scroll down, if you just just leave it right there for 1 second. The third bullet says identifications of those responsible. So what does that mean? It means they're looking to try to criminalize Israeli self-defense and engage themselves in a despicable attempt to name individuals without, they'll never know whether they were named. If I scroll down a little bit more, I give you some tips for submissions, a little bit more, where to send, okay? Now, if you click on, can you click on the word by cloud number 2? Yeah, just click on that, please. Now, don't send anything, but let me show you what happens when you do this. This is how the UN wants people to send in information. Now, if you don't click on anything. It's an anonymous upload. It's incredible. You could put in the name of anybody, any one of us on this call. Are we engaged in the protraction of the conflict by having this meeting? They'll put in the names. It'll be anonymous. You won't know that you're on a list. You won't know what the accusation is. So if we go back there, and if you scroll up a little bit more, when it says to the third bullet, identification of those responsible. So you can think of people. What about the people on campus that are responsible for promoting anti-Semitism under the guise of fair criticism of Israel, who delegitimize teachers, professors, students, student organizations that attempt to dispute this grotesque lie, for lack of a better word, misinformation. So I'm going to go up to the top and then I'm going to leave it here. If you go to this webpage, I have what I call submissions template and guidelines, and we won't have to click on it right now. But if you go there, on the template itself, it's very simple. You could go there. You could, as I say, have a link to a photograph, a picture, a name, and in that context, make a submission. The deadline is roughly the end of February because the first report is due in June. We want to make sure that our voices get out there before June. And just because you make a submission, I have to qualify one thing to make it very clear. You're not going to change their mind. You're not going to make the report better. These are people whose minds are made up. Your target is public opinion, the court of public opinion. And when you make your submission and you make your voices heard, tweet it out, use social media to disseminate it, send it to your member of Congress, or if you're joining us from abroad, to your legislators. So it's both a vehicle to ensure that they have no excuses, that when it's biased and when it ignores and twists and what you said, you will in turn call them on it. And secondly, that you will educate all those people out there that are still have an open mind. Thank you very much.
Anne, thank you so much for that information. I am now going to, let's turn that camera on. I'm now going to read you some of the questions that have come through from our audience. The first one is from Raymond, and Raymond asks, is it in the interest of American people for the United States to continue being a member of the United Nations? And if so, what can Americans do to oppose the United Nations anti-Israel bias?
This is a very important question. And the Bush administration and the Trump administration refused to join the Human Rights Council because it has a fixed agenda that will never be reformed, that specifically discriminates against the state of Israel, even in its format. So these administrations refuse to legitimize a body who's took it upon itself to delegitimize the Jewish state. The Obama administration and the Biden administration have taken a different view. And the Biden administration, therefore, joined the Human Rights Council as of January 1st of 2022. It claims that in doing so, it will work to end the agenda item on Israel alone, of the merely 10 agenda items, and it will work to change the dynamic of anti-Israel activity and behavior at the Human Rights Council. The fact is that they will completely be unable to do so. It isn't a question, it's just a matter of fact. And when they hold a vote of the 47 countries, the votes will look like either 46-1 or 46 to, a few less of a number of European abstentions. Maybe the United Kingdom will do the right thing every once in a while. But the reality is that the United States doesn't have the numbers to prevail, either at the Human Rights Council or at the General Assembly. And so, number one, no, the United States should not be on the Human Rights Council and legitimizing it. A body which, as I say, is bent on delegitimizing the state of Israel, but also one that cannot be reformed because they simply don't have the votes to accomplish it. Should the United States be a member of the United Nations is a much larger question. And the reality of the United Nations is you have a General Assembly with 193 countries, and the United States has one vote. So over and over and over again, the United States loses the vote and then turns around and presents the bill to the American public for what they didn't support, the government doesn't support. But at the Security Council, it's a little different. There is a veto of the United States, of 5 countries. And in that context, the United States has a little bit of capacity to ensure that the council does the right thing and to protect Israel from the this violent incitement to hatred that goes on in the General Assembly. Should it get off? So should it not be a part of the entire apparatus? I think the reality is, if it could be changed, the answer, if what we ought to do in the 21st century is to think about alternatives. Yes, the global community needs to talk to each other. Democracies need ways of communicating and of collaborating and so on various issues. But there's no reason on earth that we can't put our collective minds together to think about ways of doing so that don't simultaneously empower the very people who are the enemies of human rights and human decency.
Taking a slightly different look with regards to another country in the United Nations, Israel, there is a question, and the person asking wants to know if the United Nations is a kangaroo court. Professor Bayefsky, what's the point of working with the United Nations? Should Israel be in the United Nations? Why not continue to delegitimize it, call it out, but then just be done with it and move on with life?
The Israelis do not participate at the Human Rights Council, and they do not collaborate or cooperate with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which is, as I say, composed of a High Commissioner and a Secretariat staff, which is composed of individuals dedicated to the country's destruction. So as far as Israel is concerned, human rights is not supposed to be a suicide pact, so, or the protection of human rights. But the reality is that with the United States legitimizing the enterprise, Israel is in a very difficult position because the Israeli, the contributions of Israel to the UN in terms of financial reward obviously don't touch the billions of dollars coming from the United States. So the key is the US involvement and participation and legitimization, not that of the state of Israel. Israel will not cooperate. They have said that they won't cooperate with this kangaroo court, but it is up to the democratic nations around the world to stand up and to speak out against this, I don't know how else to put it, Star Chamber kangaroo court, which is antithetical to the very purposes of the United Nations to begin with. So Israel has to look to other countries to do the right thing.
A question from an anonymous attendee, and that is, that person's congresswoman, Karen Bass, told the attendee that she believes the United Nations is one of the most outstanding organizations in the world. And what would your suggested approach be to somebody like Congresswoman Karen Bass in order to change her view?
Well, the short answer in a word is not if you're a Jew, or not if you're a Jewish state. The Secretary General said today at the Holocaust Remembrance, anti-Semites don't need cutting-edge technology to spread vicious lies. And I thought to myself, not when they have the United Nations. So one could send her links to statements, grotesque anti-Semitism at the United Nations. One could point to this commission of inquiry. One could recite the lack of independence and impartiality. I mean, even, you don't have to go to law school to figure out that if you've already decided Israel's an apartheid state, and then you're given the job of finding where there is repression on the basis of racial and ethnic identity, that you don't satisfy the rules about impartiality and objectivity. So, you know, you can try to make that case. You can make it statistically. How many resolutions are there in the United Nations that are dedicated to calling out human rights violations against China? The answer is 0. So you have 1 billion people without elementary freedoms in a country like China. You have the Uyghur situation. You have genocide. As we know, in Rwanda, it was the then to be Secretary General Kofi Annan who didn't listen to the advice of the generals of the United Nations, who begged for help in preventing the genocide, or at least getting people out, so that there is this situation where even on if you looked at it from a purely statistical point of view, here's the numbers on Israel, and here are the numbers on all the rest of the rest of the countries in the world. That kind of statistical analysis may be persuasive. It's possible. But I think the main thing is to raise your voice, to use this as an opportunity to speak up. And as I say, I encourage you to do so. Let me say this about social media. We know that, you know, who has time to listen to a webinar of an hour, or to read a long article. We know that people get their information in small sound bites in you know, whether it's TikTok or you know, any of these other tweeting and so on, or Twitter, but Instagram. I urge you, especially young people who are savvy about the kinds of messaging that will make a difference, can reach large numbers of people, to do just that, to get online and start making a difference. You have the tools. I've given you the information. I will continue to update it every day. Start making a difference.
Also linked to making a difference, there's a question from Isabella Marcus, and that is, can we put pressure on the diplomats of other countries to drop this commission?
The commission is created by the Human Rights Council. It has no end date. It's never going to come back or be revisited. It doesn't have to be renewed every year like other human commissions of inquiry. So one would have to prevail upon the members of the Human Rights Council to adopt a new resolution withdrawing it. The chances of doing so, when the majority of countries are A, not democracies, and B, are controlled in terms of the power structure by Islamic states, is, to my best analysis, 0, absolutely 0. So, but what could you then, but the council's report and its resolutions and so on will then go to the General Assembly, and there will be reports at the General Assembly. Can the General Assembly be prevailed upon to terminate funding, to adopt a resolution ending this commission of inquiry? In theory, yes. But there are, of the 193 countries, 117 of them, 119 approximately, are members of the so-called non-aligned movement, the developing world, which unfortunately, the largest single voting bloc in the non-aligned world, which is called the NAM countries, non-aligned movement, is the Organization of Islamic Conference or Cooperation. So can Muslim countries be convinced to vote on, to change their positions? Can the NAM countries, the non-aligned countries that are in the developing world but are not Islamic, be convinced to change their position so that they vote with democratic states and against this inquiry, or to terminate it. It's a very long battle. And I think whereas that could possibly happen many years or down the road, the very first step to making that a real proposition is to delegitimize the whole enterprise to begin with. And that takes work. That means your voices count. I can't say it enough. For far too long, the view has been, who cares about the UN? Set it aside, ignore it, get on with life. Nobody cares. That's absolutely false. It changes. What motivates Apartheid Week is all the misinformation coming in from the United Nations or through Israel's enemies via the United Nations, so that it changes the narrative. And for far too long, we've ignored it. If you can put it in terms of human rights, if you care about human rights, then you care about the inequality of the Jewish people and the Jewish nation. If you care about the human rights, you'll care about all those individuals who are ignored and bypassed and delegitimized or thrown aside in the desperate attempt to monopolize the UN structure to harm the state of Israel. So it's important to cast it as a human rights crusade or effort, or as a open-minded one, as a religious one that's guided and by freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and so on, and to stop letting the other side manipulate, distort, and appropriate both the language of human rights and in particular this effort to terminate a Jewish country by going back to its beginning and rewriting history, appropriating history. So we can't get sanguine about that, and but it's up to each and every person. Each of you counts, and especially on an International Holocaust Remembrance Day. If we took away nothing from today, it's that every individual matters.
A technical question. Somebody's got a question on how the resolution setting up this inquiry worked. Can you please explain how the Human Rights Council was able to get this resolution passed without the votes of Western countries?
Oh, the Western countries don't have the majority. It's a up-down vote. Majority rules. The countries that voted against it were Austria, Bulgaria, Cameroon, Czech Republic, Germany, Malawi, Marshall Islands, and the United Kingdom and Uruguay. They all voted against it. That's 9. 14 abstentions, to their extraordinary shame. Country like France and the Netherlands, Poland, Italy, they abstained. But the vote was 24 in favor, 9 against, and 14 abstentions. So all you have to do is be able to count. Not complicated. We don't have the votes.
We don't have the votes, but there's the Abraham Accords that's been making progress, and we're seeing a lot of nations signing up to that. With the Abraham Accords now in play, have you seen a shift in voting patterns with nations that are signed up to the Accords?
No, I couldn't care less. The United Nations has a completely different dynamic. Israel has very good bilateral relations with a lot of countries before and after the Abraham Accords. It's not reflected in their votes. It ought to be, it should be. There's no reason why a country like India abstained. given the close relationship with a country like India. And one could go on, or Brazil for that matter. So it's not reflected because there's no price to be paid. If you vote one way against Israel, well, what difference is it going to make? Is anybody going to terminate your, your bilateral financial relations? The answer is no. It doesn't. Is the United States Congress going to step in and say, okay, you voted against the United States, for example, on whatever resolution it is against Israel, there ought to be a consequence for that. You invited, and in fact, you voted against the United States on resolutions that are about simply the United States. There's still no price to be paid. So until this country actually follows UN resolutions and voting patterns with tangible consequences in terms of financial and other relationships, they don't have an incentive to vote in a way which reflects their actual views of of right and wrong.
Wow. Switching it back, we've got 2 more questions left. So quickly switching it back to what can we do? Because there's things that we can do and must do. There is a question that says, will it be useful to upload published material about UNRWA and how there's the actual teaching of Palestinian children to hate, as well as just generally teaching people to hate the Jews, hate Israel?
The answer is absolutely. I mean, think about this. If you look back to the what they're charged with doing, right? They're charged with doing the no temporal end date, as they say, no temporal restrictions, as they will say, no temporal restrictions, all violations of human rights and international law, all underlying root causes of instability, protraction of conflict, including systematic discrimination and repression based on religious identity or racial identity. So of course, UNRWA is part of the problem. And you don't have to write it. I mean, you don't have to be an expert. You can go online, look for materials that already exist and send them in. Maybe you did them in class. Maybe you saw a speech, a videotape, a tweet, a Facebook entry, and you thought, it helped you identify, don't forget, identification of those responsible. Why do UNRWA counts for that? It would classify as an identification of those responsible. But what about the people that are all around you? It doesn't have to be over there. It could be right here in America. We can think of people who are responsible for the protraction of the conflict right here. Put their names in, give a link, give evidence as to what they have and haven't said on social media, in Congress and elsewhere, online, in written materials. It's completely open-ended. And given the fact that any of us could find ourselves with our names before the council as guilty of incitement, protraction of the conflict, there's absolutely no reason that we should not do the same. Let's start with the Mufti of Jerusalem, a collaborator with the Nazis. There's a picture of him, al-Husseini, sitting beside Hitler. Put in the picture, put in the date, and say, you're looking for root causes? How about the Palestinian leadership and its venerates a collaborator with Nazi Germany? So, and that's all you have to say. It doesn't have to be complicated. Few words, already existing material. It all counts. And by the way, there's no limit. You have many hundreds, thousands of things you want to set in. Go ahead. Instead of playing video games in your spare time, start making submissions. think about getting together and thinking, you know, this really matters. I'm upset. I'm mad as hell, and I'm not going to take it anymore, as that infamous movie said. So, but it counts. It's real. It's raw. It's and it's legitimate.
One last question on the submissions, Anne. In addition to the United Nations, should we be sending our submissions anywhere? Are you collecting them? Is there a central place where they're going to be kept? What's the process?
Yes, I am collecting them. That's why if you go down to that link, submissions, and it says where to send, there's a little bucket saying where to send, or also in the guideline template up at the top, it gives you 3 addresses. It gives you the address of the United Nations itself, an email address. It gives you the cloud, which they will not acknowledge in terms of your submission. So you do the UN website, email address, the cloud, and number 3, our email address, which I give. Why should you do that? You don't have to do that, obviously, if you don't want to. But if you do, you should know that we will collect them. And unless you tell us otherwise, we'll make it public. We'll make it at least public that you, with your permission, that you made a submission, that you counted, that you stood up when the time mattered. You were there. So yes, it's very important not just to make submissions and then, you know, hope somebody reads them at the other end, but to use them. As I say, we'll make them public with your permission, and we'll collect them. We're engaged in that service, and you yourself can do everything you can to make your submissions, as I say, through social media and through all kinds of other means. And by the way, if you're at school, if you're in various schools, there's no reason why you couldn't have a class on this subject. Why you couldn't have an after-school meeting about it. Why you couldn't have a club meeting. Whether you're in high school, in junior high school, middle school, giving away my Canadian background, or university or college. There's no reason you can't get together and think about how you want to make submissions most effectively. But as I say, don't pine over, don't waste time. We've got a month. Why do we have a month? That you just make clear. June is the first time they're going to report. Then we won't want to give them an excuse that they didn't get the submissions in time. They couldn't possibly read them. So our best guess is if you get them in the next few weeks, that excuse is really just that. It doesn't hold water. So so time is of the essence.
And thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for sharing very generously your knowledge and your expertise on this topic, and also your insight into what's going on, so that we know what's happening, and more importantly, so that we know how to act. Club Z, also on behalf of our founder as well as executive director, we want to thank everybody for joining us this evening, and say a special thank you to Stand With Us as well as ICC for helping to bring this to the great audience that we had this evening. Club Z teens and families, we will be having various debriefs so that we can strategize on making sure that we make our submissions, that we spread the word, and that we definitely cause a ripple effect with regards to people having an understanding on the urgency and the importance of us doing something. And also importantly, look for us on YouTube, where you'll see our channel. And in addition to the various materials that are already on our YouTube channel that can also be used for purposes of the submissions, will be a copy of this evening's recording so that you can rewatch it, familiarize yourself with what's going on, and also importantly, share this video, share this recording far and wide. So we want to just take the time to thank everybody this evening. Have a great evening, and we'll see you soon.
Bye.